The first emotional wound that most people receive is the wound of separation from the mother. Here to discuss this with me today from a medical astrology and self-healing and self-muscle testing perspective is Elizabeth Clark, who is a former clinical nutritionist and biomedical researcher and the co-founder of the Discernment Framework, which is a self-healing and self-muscle testing protocol that is absolutely amazing. Thank you, Elizabeth, so much for being here with us today. I'm so excited for this talk.
Thank you for having me. This is so long overdue and so important. I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. And so we're going to be kind of diving into something pretty deep today. And a lot of people don't have a good foundation of what we're going to be talking about. So let's start with the first thing first. What is the mother wound? And we're not talking necessarily about someone being a bad mother. We're not like mother shaming people. This is actually a wound of feeling separate from the mother or actually being physically separated from the mother at the time of birth, and it gets triggered in different ways. And so tell us a little bit about what that looks like.
Sure. So, like you mentioned, this is our perception of being separate from the mother. So, I know you and I have both seen some like comments if we talk about the mother wound, about like let's just blame the mother kind of thing. That's not actually the case. Like you can be a great mother, you can have a great mother, and you can still perceive, this feeling of separation. From like a self-healing and self-muscle testing perspective, this shows up as a constellation of feelings that have an affinity for some specific places in the body, either where pathology is being experienced at the same time as these emotions, and then they kind of get trapped in the scar tissue, or there was already pathology in these parts of the bodies, like the kidneys or the reproductive organs, and then you experience the emotions associated with them, and they kind of get stuck instead of just like being processed out and moving through. And I can pull up actually a list of some of the common emotions that I've seen with this. If you want me to just kind of.
Yeah, absolutely. And while you're doing that, I just want to mention that you can actually look and see which parts of your body have these innate weaknesses that could be triggered through the mother wound or other emotional traumas, other traumatic experiences in your life. And Elizabeth and I are going to be covering that in great detail in our Revealing and Healing Stuck Emotions, Medical Astrology, and Muscle Testing workshop. It's not even a workshop anymore. This is like a full-on training mini course. You're going to get a crash course in medical astrology. You're going to get advanced muscle testing training. You're going to get a 2-hour live workshop where we're going to be diving deep into the connections between your life experiences, your traumas, your body. And then we're going to do advanced muscle testing to figure out exactly what is stuck in where. And so this is huge, you guys. You can use this to help yourself, to help other people. We're going to put the link down in the description below because if you're watching this video live, you're going to get a discount before we raise the price, and you're going to get a bonus Q&A where you get to ask us all of your questions. And so that being said,
We outdid ourselves. We harnessed that Mars Jupiter energy and
we
we put
went
it to good
wild.
use.
So I'm super excited for that. Oh, it's August 29th, by the way.
Yes.
So go ahead and let's get into the list of emotions that are really common to get stuck with the mother wound.
Sure. So this is just straight from like Chinese medicine. Like I didn't, make this stuff up or anything. But typically the two like biggest emotions, and then there's like a subset, like a list that comes along, underneath these that are a little bit more specific. The two biggest ones are fear and shame.
Mm.
And fear, oftentimes we see get stuck in the kidneys. Shame is more so stuck in like the bladder and the reproductive organs. However, they can get stuck in both places. So it's not like it's necessarily an exact science. It's more of like a correlation. But the kidneys and the bladder and the reproductive organs all fall under the element of water. And that's why these emotions are kind of all in the same like category. So in terms of like the kidneys, we have fear as the main emotion, but then there's guilt, powerlessness, broken will, deep disappointment, demoralization, bad news, fright, deep exhaustion, survival, and brutal. And these might seem like kind of, some of these are like a little bit weird, but you have to understand that like they kind of have to be translated through the lens of like the natal chart or, your own
Yeah.
experiences or self muscle testing to really get an understanding because there is a difference between just fear versus anxiety
Yeah.
or anxiety versus fright. And then for the bladder and the reproductive organs underneath shame, we have very upset, feeling paralyzed, not standing on one's own feet, shyness, hurt, helplessness, unfulfilled yearning, embarrassed, self-pity, and resignation. And, if you think about kind of like the hierarchy of like, vibrations of emotions, these are all like at the very bottom.
Yeah.
These are emotions where you don't want to get stuck on them. But it's kind of a catch-22 because it's harder to take action when you're feeling these emotions. And that's, I think, part of the reason why the mother wound is um, one of the more like self-identified emotional wounds is that like when we're thinking about like self-pity, when we're in the headspace of like where was I wronged in life, like we're in that kind of like lower frequency of looking for how we perceived that we were wronged.
Absolutely. And like thinking about your relationship with your mother in childhood, like that is the core relationship. It's your safety, it's your security, it's how you feel comfortable and taken care of. And, without that, there will be a lot of fear, anxiety, all of these other kind of like base emotions that are around survival. And kind of going into a little bit more of how this develops, thinking about it just from like a logical perspective, like we are a part of our mother until we go through that process of childbirth, and then we become a separate person. And astrologically speaking, that separation occurs at the exact moment that you take your first breath separate from the mother. And that time, that moment where you become a separate person, you become yourself, that is represented by the ascendant. We are born in through the ascendant, through that horizon, that sign that was rising on the eastern horizon at the exact moment, placement, and perspective of our birth. And so that's where you can see a lot of issues involving like birth trauma. Does that come up more with the mother wound? Like if somebody has a traumatic birth, does that show up more with a stronger mother wound energy?
It can. More specifically, the belly button will show up as a scar that's holding on to separation trauma. So even if the birth
Interesting.
itself wasn't traumatic, trauma that you're experiencing related to your mother gets stored in that first scar that you received at birth. Because regardless of how you were born, there was an umbilical cord,
Mhm.
it was that severing, of that tie to your mother. But yeah, absolutely. Like just how traumatic was that initial separation? It's not something you're going to have a conscious memory of, but it's something that you can find, within your body and within your subconscious mind.
Yeah, and that's something that you can absolutely see astrologically as well. And you can also kind of see, if the mother was going through maybe a traumatic experience around the time of birth and if that's impacting you in some way. So the circumstances that are happening close to that birth moment will also often show up. And so would you say that that's something that could be related to that wound? Like maybe it's carried over into the child, like around the time of childbirth?
Yes, absolutely. I just got goosebumps thinking about that. A lot of the trauma that is controlling, our day-to-day lives, 90% of our decisions are being controlled by the things that we don't remember and the things that are inherited, through our family lineage. So what your mother was going through at the time of birth, absolutely. But what your mother experienced before you were even conceived is also something that you're carrying in your body. You can carry this, sort of mother wound from a great grandmother. I was actually just talking to, one of my colleagues who does similar work with self muscle testing and trauma about this whole like family lineage that she recently just uncovered and is healing around like trauma from the great grandmother and like her separation and how it showed up in her reproductive system.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes perfect sense. And again, we kind of like move to other areas of the chart through this. But, if you're looking at your parents and ancestral and generational types of trauma, you would be looking at the fourth house and the IC and also the fourth house and IC rulers. And so often you can see that type of thing. If it's something that, was a grandmother or great grandmother that was then passed down to your grandmother and then to your mother, and your mother kind of transmitted it to you through either her unconscious behaviors and actions that she wasn't quite thinking about, or through her DNA, through epigenetics, like that will show up often with that fourth house energy. And so the fourth house represents the parents in astrology, both parents, but especially the mother.
Yeah. And like you were saying, like you can have a traumatic birth, or your mom could have, a traumatic experience giving birth. And for one person, it may not be something significant in their life, but for another person, this sort of constellation of emotions related to it gets stuck
Yeah.
and becomes this like major sort of subconscious driving like factor in their behavior and in their lives. And there's also ways to see that in the natal chart. And with self muscle testing, it's like just because it happened does not make it like the the most significant thing in your life, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like some people deal better with these types of situations than others. And some of those people who will experience these like big traumas or things that maybe should be impacting them more, or we think should just based on our own outside perspective, will be not impacted by that, but impacted by something that we perceive as being like minor. And so everybody's different and everybody is weak in different areas and strong in different areas. And that's the beauty of astrology because it can show you that. And then from there, you can kind of look at where in the body you might be more susceptible to those weaknesses and what's actually stuck there using these advanced muscle testing techniques. Which, by the way, when we say advanced muscle testing, we're not talking about just like normal, like yes or no questions, like pulling someone's arm, like that type of thing. Like this is way more complicated. So maybe we should talk a little bit about that before we move on so people understand what the heck we're talking about.
That makes sense. I totally just dove in like everybody knows like what that is.
Yeah.
Essentially, you can get um, a reading from your body about what is the truth versus what is a lie. That's just sort of the foundation of muscle testing. That's the concept, is that research has shown certain muscles will strengthen in the presence of the truth, and those same muscles will weaken in the presence of a lie. And it's actually more complicated than that. And that's where we get into like the advanced version of things, because something that might be regarded as like a false negative, or like you got the answer was no, but it was actually a yes in real life. Using a more advanced form of self muscle testing, you don't experience like false negatives in that sense, because there's a lot of nuance. It might not have been a weakening of the muscles, it might have been a relaxation of the muscles, and you can't tell the difference because it's either you sway forward or you sway back.
Mhm.
And that's how we self muscle test. There are different finger methods. There is an O-ring method that is accurate, but it's more complicated than what you're going to find on YouTube or Google. And it can't really be used in this context of pinpointing different organs, and pathologies in the body. So the old kind of self muscle testing with the sway method was you just hold your hands here and you can ask a yes or no question, or you can hold a supplement in your hand and it's either a forward or a backward. Forward means you take it, backward means you don't. It's a great place to start. And if you're a really intuitive person, and you don't have a ton of like nervous system dysregulation or chronic illness, you can take that method very far. But in today's world, most people are going to have issues with inconsistencies and inaccuracies if they're not using a more advanced form. So in the advanced version of this, we number one, take away the mental energy of asking a question and the limitations of asking a verbal or mental question, because you have to be really good at investigating to ask the right questions. And sometimes you will think you're getting inaccurate answers, but you're just not asking the questions correctly. So a lot of what we do in advanced muscle testing is we use basically our fingertips and palms of our hands, sides of our hands connected to each other, our fingertips connected to each other, or connected to different parts of our bodies to create the question in our brains instantaneously, essentially. So there have been imaging studies, MRIs, and such, where connecting the fingertips in certain ways to certain places actually changes the activity of your brain. And this is where the question comes from. You're not asking a question. That's one of the number one things like people get confused about when they see my reels on Instagram, is like, so what was the question? I'm like, that was the question. You just put your hand here and that's the
Yeah.
question. So it's like kind of like a secret language that you have to learn if you want to do this more advanced thing. But the other piece of this being more advanced is that you're controlling for nervous system dysregulation before you get started. So
Yeah.
you know that your brain is able to answer these questions quickly, able to recognize where the hands are being placed and what that means, which just comes down to proprioception. Like, how quickly does your body recognize the difference between left and right, up and down, front and back? And your brain has to do that instantaneously to give you an accurate answer when you put, your fingertips in different places. So we fix that before we start testing. It's like a 90-second process. And then we go into testing primarily without asking questions. But there is also, when it comes to like astrology readings, I will ask a question, sometimes just to kind of confirm that I'm looking at something and interpreting it correctly, because there's
Mhm.
90 billion ways to interpret every little thing in astrology, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's human error, like it's nice to have like a little double check, with your astrology readings. But I also will sometimes just look at something, and looking at the picture is the question itself,
Mhm.
So that's probably like kind of complicated, but that's as easy as I can make it sound.
It's a good frame of reference. And then you guys, it does sound more complicated than it really is once you see it happening. And in our training, Elizabeth has like a 45-minute training where she actually shows you and walks you through step by step what to do so you can practice it multiple times before we go into the workshop and actually go in and test ourselves. And I think kind of what you were getting at with the medical astrology versus muscle testing portion of it is that medical astrology gives you this bird's eye, like broad picture view. And it's wonderful. You can see a lot and you can see how everything is connected. However, if you're going in there saying, like, specifically what's wrong with me, like, I can see, like, hey, it's likely that I might have something going on with my, intestines right now, or I might be more susceptible to it and it's being activated at this time. But that could mean a lot of things, right? It could be an inflammatory response. It could be a parasite. It could be a bacteria. It could be an emotional situation that is specifically impacting my gut. And how do I know exactly what that is? Astrology can get you close to that, right? It can give you what you need to be looking at, but then from there, you have to get more detailed. And so the self muscle testing is huge for that.
Yes. Yeah, that's why I love it. It is a screening tool, and that's how I use medical astrology as well. It's like, if you can combine two screening tools together, then you have two good pieces of data.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I like about the medical astrology too, when I use the self muscle testing, because medical astrology is more my thing. Obviously, the self healing and the self muscle testing is more your thing. And so I'll take what I'm like seeing through the muscle testing and understanding, and then I'll look at it in the context of the chart again. And then I'm like, oh, this is actually connected to the fact that I'm a workaholic and I overdid it. And,
Yeah.
I'm having this specific stressor going on right now. You can kind of go back and forth with it, which is, I think, really fun. And it gives you a
Yes.
lot more nuance and a lot to work with.
Yes. And I think we may have talked about this before, and I think you might have said you're the same way, but A lot of times when I do a reading, like, I don't want context from the person, like, asking for the reading. Like, I wanna go in completely blinded, and if I can, like, self muscle test along with that, like, I'm golden, but, like, it's kind of like a substitution for having context from the person, but it's like a more objective substitution
Yes.
for the context.
Well, because we both have worked in the research field, and we know that self-reported data is like wildly inaccurate. And so when we're as astrologers or even as like clinicians, when we're asking clients for information, like you have to go in knowing that that is from their subjective perspective and it's probably not correct.
Yes.
Like it's correct to them, but it's not giving you the whole picture and it's probably not giving you the information you need. And I do find when I have too much context from a client, when I'm doing a medical astrology reading, like I'm biased all of a sudden because I have these ideas in my head from them. And so I have to kind of like shut it out. So there's specific information I want, especially with timing of activations of things or timing of things that have
Yeah.
happened related to that illness. But I don't want all of this. I don't want every diagnosis and everything your doctor said because that's just in my brain then. And then I'm going to think it's that, right? I want to see what I think it
Exactly.
is from my perspective without that.
Mhm. The thing that, like, you as, like, a client thinks is important is probably not the thing that's important, but, like,
Mhm.
you're going to focus on that thing, and that's absolutely the case with trauma. Like, it is nearly impossible to name an emotion that you're feeling without muscle testing. It's like you think you know what you felt, but when you go in and you're looking at the emotion list, it's like, "Huh, like, that is not what I thought it was." But all of a sudden, you're looking at that word, that emotion, and you're, like, ready to, like, break out in tears. It's like, obviously, that's the emotion, but never in a million years would you have told your astrologer, like, "This is the emotion I'm feeling about this situation," you know? And
Yeah.
the same goes for trauma. It's like you remember a situation, about your childhood, like your parents separating, whatever, and you may have focused on one aspect of that, and actually the trauma was this different aspect of it.
Absolutely. And like, so the astrology doesn't lie, your body, the energy doesn't lie. And so that's a really great place to gain more information and kind of going back to the mother wound now.
Yeah.
So this wound of separation that has so many different emotions and a lot of fear based and kind of like root chakra emotions attached to it. What happens later in life when you have difficult connections with your mother or a difficult experience involving your mother that hurts the relationship or even maybe creates a physical separation? Because we talked about this a little bit off camera, but there's this initial separation wound. We all have it, at least to some extent. And maybe it doesn't impact us for the first 25 years, but then we have a horrible fight or a really bad situation. And all of a sudden, we're no longer connected to our mother in the same way. What does that look like?
Yeah. In terms of like where you see this in the body, um, one of the ways will be, let's say, you're storing the separation in the scar that is, your belly button, basically. Like who would have thought, like who would have even, considered checking there? But this trauma, the separation can actually get stuck in any scar or any organ. It just happens to often get stuck, in the belly button. Um, it creates this sort of static interference between the cells in your body. So your cell to cell communication um, gets basically fuzzier. And over time, over 10 years, 20 years, different parts of the body receive less uptake of oxygen, nutrients, therapies, medications, anything that you're doing to fix some symptom that you've had for the past, like 10 years. It started probably because that part of your body wasn't receiving proper nutrition, proper, oxygen, but it also can't be healed because it's not receiving what you're putting into your body. So you're, taking all these supplements and whatnot, and they're going to certain parts of your body, but they are specifically not making it to other parts. And there's these like afferent and efferent connections between organs, essentially. So this can happen with a scar, like the belly button. It's not like uptake to your belly button is going to be the problem. Your belly button's going to cause an uptake problem somewhere else in the body. So you
Mhm.
see chronic illness, chronic symptoms manifest somewhere else in the body. So the same thing can happen with organs. The kidneys are often a place where you'll see these, separation, mother wound emotions getting trapped. But the kidneys are connected to the lungs. So let's say the emotions get trapped in the kidneys and then they manifest as some sort of chronic, symptom or chronic illness with the lungs, or vice versa. A lot of times, like with grief, if you lost your mother, if she passed away, then you see the connection kind of going the other direction. The trauma is trapped in the lungs, but the kidneys are showing up as the pathology. And there's just so many different pathologies that can be associated with something like the kidneys because they're filtering out all of
Yeah.
these toxins and pathogens. And some of the toxins that have an affinity for the kidneys, like glyphosate, for instance, also damage the kidneys. So you have this place in your body, this organ in your body that is going to accumulate toxins. And because of that, it's going to be a preferred place for, pathogens to also accumulate, for trauma to also accumulate. And something like the kidneys have a higher concentration of DNA than other parts of the body and other organs in the body. And your memories are stored in your DNA. So good memories, bad memories, it doesn't matter. Your traumatic experiences are memories that are getting stored in your DNA. So you have these certain parts of the body that have these really important functions that are just, working 24/7 to try and keep you healthy. And if they're bogged down with trauma, after 10 or 20 years, you're going to see all kinds of, chronic illness coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not a proximity thing, right? So like it's if it's stored in the belly button, or let's say, you had a really bad surgical procedure or something like that at the same time that you were fighting with your mother and it got
Right.
trapped in your shoulder or something.
Yeah,
That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be something in your arm or even in this region, right? It could happen
that's correct.
anywhere.
That's correct. And a good example of this are teeth, because teeth are another place where trauma just like loves to get trapped, probably because they're ruled by Saturn. Like, I
Yeah.
don't know if there's like a cause in it, like they're ruled by Saturn, so they're gonna cause pathology, but there's an association there, right? Like, so for me, like Saturn had a lot to do with my chronic illness, and it was not only my teeth, but my spine. And trauma that gets trapped in the teeth can be as close to the teeth as shoulder pain. You have a root canal on the left side, and now you have left side shoulder pain. Or it could be as distant as your knee. You have a root canal on the left side, and now your left knee needs surgery 10 years later. And these are real examples that are like published in textbooks, and it's a field of study called neural therapy. And it's available in some countries. It's available in the US. It's just not readily available in the US, but it's more popular in places like Germany, where it originated from. But it's basically the study of how are certain parts of the body getting injured and then affecting completely different parts of the body regardless of proximity.
Mhm.
And the underlying thing that they have in common is that trauma seems to be the difference between an injury that doesn't do this and an injury that does do this.
Oh. That is absolutely fascinating. And to kind of like bring it back to the mother wound, because we could go in so many directions, you guys, with this. We could talk about everything. This relates to everything, but we're giving you one specific example. We'll go into everything in our training. So definitely, again, look at that link below if this is fascinating to you, because it's fascinating to me. But astrologically speaking, the mother is represented by the moon. The moon is the general significator of the mother. It's also the general significator of bodily health. And so there's a connection there. So something that is triggered involving a difficult situation with the mother that involves a difficult configuration with the moon can also indicate weaknesses throughout the body, a constitutional weakness. But in addition to this, if you want to get more specific, in women, reproductive function, the womb, like our reproductive organs and our reproductive hormones, those are all represented by the moon. Do you find with women specifically that have this separation wound, this mother wound, that they end up having more reproductive issues?
Yes, unexplained infertility for
Mhm.
sure. Um, and then also the bladder and the kidneys, because, in Chinese medicine, they're related to the reproductive organs, chronic UTIs, interstitial cystitis, things where
Mhm.
it's like chronic, but also kind of unexplained. And I don't have a whole lot of experience with this, but every time I've spoken with a client who has like chronic UTIs or interstitial cystitis or unexplained infertility, there is this unexplained quality to it. Like, why does this keep recurring?
Mhm.
And why do none of the treatments that I've tried work? People will do many rounds of IVF and not see resolution. They'll do many rounds of antibiotics for chronic UTIs and still not see a resolution. And there is probably almost definitely that mother wound component.
That makes a lot of sense. And I told you off camera, but I'll repeat it again for everyone else. Like something that I've seen, because a lot of people these days are dealing with infertility and reproductive issues. It's like an epidemic. And so I get a lot of clients and a lot of students in my medical astrology courses asking me about things like PCOS, endometriosis, infertility in general, like all of this. Like, how can I increase my fertility? I want to become pregnant. And you'll see a lot with women. It's always Venus. Venus also has to do with the kidneys, right? And
Yeah.
Venus it rules the eggs, it rules the ovum. So Venus is an important factor. So you'll see, and Venus is the endocrine system balance, like in general. And so you'll see a lot of Venusian issues, but you'll also see a lot of moon issues. And one that I've researched very heavily because it's so common these days is PCOS, which I know that you've healed from.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's that common. And I've seen a lot of PCOS with trans Pluto. And so trans Pluto is a hypothetical planet that lies beyond the boundaries of Pluto. And I got this information from one of my teachers, Lynn Coiner, who is researching it. And she sees trans Pluto implicated very heavily in PCOS and insulin resistance and diabetes. And these things are also very much connected. But with women, what you'll see is a strong trans Pluto placement. Trans Pluto is in Leo for most people who are born today, a few in Virgo for like really young people. And what you'll see is a connection between the sun, moon rising, or Venus and trans Pluto. And then if it's not the moon that's with trans Pluto, there will be an afflicted moon. So the moon will be in some sort of placement where it's challenged very heavily. And that combination shows up very commonly with PCOS because, and this is the other part of it, the psychological component, that trans Pluto being prevalent in the chart indicates having one or both parents that are hypercritical of the child. And in PCOS cases, it's usually the mother. And the common denominator is not that there was a hypercritical, mother that had high demands on the child. And it's usually well intentioned, but there's just like, a lot of demand placed on this child, this little girl. But the relationship goes unresolved. And I've seen it because like the mother dies, like very literally. And so there's no way to actually physically resolve the relationship. You'd have to kind of do a different type of work on that. Or it's just you never actually end up having a good relationship with the mother. And so there's a separation component where you are separated from the mother first due to this like hypercritical state where you're wanting to become sovereign, you're wanting to become separate, you want to be your own person so you're not subject to all this criticism. And then later on, it becomes more of a proximity thing or more of an actual physical thing where the mother's not around. And it plays back into that wound of separation like perfectly, but you'll see this so commonly. Not every PCOS case is like this. Sometimes there's other root causes, but this is a really common one.
Yeah. And there's also kind of an interesting, a different interesting like physical component that kind of ties the mother wound and trauma back to the reproductive system. And that's actually parasites. We
Oh,
see like parasites hold on to all things, all toxic things. And in a sense, they protect us because they're doing that.
yeah.
But there can be overgrowth and there can be, when they release those toxins, like there's a bunch of reasons why you might not want all of those parasites all the time. But they do hold on to those traumas and they love the reproductive system. And in some cases, I think that it is possible, and not just possible, but it has been shown in some cases that endometriosis and PCOS has a parasitic component to it,
No.
like the actual parasite sacs themselves, and the parasites kind of causing the tissue to grow outside of the uterus instead of just inside of the uterus. But I think that is part of hanging on to that mother wound. It's like parasites are hanging on to these things, and whether or not they gravitate towards your reproductive system, to kind of like set up shop and like, hang on there, depends on what the trauma was. If if the trauma was separation from the mother, then it's more likely that that's where the parasites are going to be, because parasites can be in any part of your body. If it was, trauma with the father, it might be that the parasites are in your heart. But in this case, because it's the mother wound, it's going to be associated with those sets of organs that are associated with the mother.
That's so interesting. And like that always makes me think about how like parasites reproduce at the full moon and the new moon. And so they like have this lunar cycle.
Yes. I think just the moon in general is so interesting in terms of like how it signifies trauma in the mother and health, and why the feelings you have about your mother and that relationship are so much more important to your health than maybe your feelings about other experiences you've had, because the moon is your perception, it's feelings, it's the body, it's the mother. It just like inherently represents all of these things. Like how could they not all be significant, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't believe anything is coincidence. The law of correspondence is real. And so, there's something going on there for sure. And then what else should we touch on with this mother wound? Is there anything that we're missing?
Let me look at I think it might be worth mentioning that every time I post something on Instagram about the mother wound, I get a lot of interaction from people. And every now and then, like every maybe like 10th comment, someone will say, "What about the father wound?"
Mhm.
And I'll post kind of what I think could loosely be considered the father wound, and there's just a fraction of the interaction. So I think I'm not exactly sure what it is, but there's something worth mentioning about like the prevalence of the mother wound, or like how we perceive that to be much more of a core wound than anything related to our father. And I do think it has to do with that degree of separation, because of the degree of closeness that we had with our mother, regardless of whether you knew your mother or you were close to your mother after birth. You did come from her body, and you didn't come from your father's body. And we actually see a lot of the father's lineage of trauma, not necessarily like trauma between you and your father, but could be. But we see that lineage of trauma coming through the heart, which is
Mhm.
the
The
sun,
father and
right?
yeah.
Leo. You have the sun and you have the moon and you have, the father and the mother. But for whatever reason, um, that separation from the mother just seems to be so much more detrimental And again, it is all about your perception and your physical and natal chart, predisposition to have those feelings stuck inside of your body.
And you know what I've noticed just like working with thousands of people all over the world is that people do tend to take that relationship with the mother, or especially if there is actually a because some people are bad mothers. That's a
Sure.
real thing. We're not shaming mothers here in general, but sometimes there's a bad relationship. The mother does things that are inappropriate. Like there's something going on there. And people tend to take that way more personally. I think because the moon is that subjective, like inner reality, and it is very personal. And then if there's something going on with the father, it's taken more as like this is a character building experience. Like I became the way that I am because my father did this and I learned not to do that, or because I had to deal with this and I had to overcome it. Versus with the mother, it seems to be held on to a little bit more. So I think you're right about something with that.
They're very different archetypes. If you identify like with your core wound being the mother wound, it is a very different archetype than if you identify with the father wound being your core wound. The father wound is more about achievement. It's more
Hmm.
about like proving that you're worthy of love. And the
Yes.
mother wound is more about
Yes.
fear and anxiety and, guilt. It's just very, very different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why like mothers get a bad rap and they get kind of like blamed for everything. And that's why when you
Yeah.
talk about this, it is triggering. And we'll get some triggered comments, I'm sure, down in the comment section because yeah, it's different. Like it's not the same. We don't carry it the same. We don't express it the same. There's not the same type of blame. There's more
Right.
self-responsibility and accountability that comes with that father wound often. And so
Right.
it's odd, but astrologically it makes sense to me.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I mean, from a traditional sense, like the mother had most of the, and still has most of the responsibility in
Yes.
terms of like the well-being of the child. Like ideally, we're going to try to feed them from our own bodies. So for at least a certain period of time, you're probably going to be responsible for keeping that baby alive, with
Yeah.
breastfeeding. Whereas the father could be there or not be there. That the baby honestly doesn't know or care if the father's there or not. It doesn't, babies don't have words. They can't understand that. But if they're not in close proximity to the mother, they don't need words to understand that. They feel it in their nervous system.
Okay. Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And that's not to discount the role of the father. Having
Right.
a male presence that's really loving and, this beautiful energy, that's obviously helpful. That's going to
Yeah,
enhance the child's like everything.
yeah,
But yeah, it
absolutely.
is different.
And fathers can take on the role of mother.
Yes.
Fathers can
Yes.
regulate the nervous system of the baby. They can be the source of nourishment for the baby, like absolutely. But there is no baby that came directly from the father's body. And that's
Yeah.
just something that our nervous systems can't forget. We can consciously not think about it, but it is part of our whole body.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this has been a super fascinating conversation, and we've kind of gone all over the place. I think if you guys want more, you're definitely going to have to check out our workshop. But Elizabeth, where can people find you to learn more about the discernment framework, to get a bigger taste of like what it is that you're doing here with self muscle testing and all of it?
Instagram is pretty much where I live. So my Instagram handle is elizabeth.a.clark.ms. And you can go watch a bunch of reels of me swaying. Some of them are actual demonstrations that you can follow along and like see if you can do them. Some of them it's just B-roll of me like doing testing on myself with like reels type type words on the screen. So don't take it as like a place to learn self muscle testing. It is social media. And I just want to give that disclaimer that you will not learn how to accurately self muscle testing from watching a million of my reels, but it is the best place to start if you're interested in this and want to learn more. And you can go through the reels. I have a ton of free resources that will teach you how to regulate your nervous system so you can self muscle test, teach you how to self muscle test so that you can find and heal trauma, all these things. And there's different keywords basically that you comment.
Absolutely. Yeah. Her Instagram is just a wealth of knowledge. And you actually can learn some techniques from her Instagram too. So I think you're discounting it a little too much. Like, yes, some of it is just like fun to watch and it's intriguing, but some of it actually has really good demonstration in it that you can actually do in real time. And especially if they take your other trainings. So I'm going to link those down below. And especially if you show up for the Revealing and Healing, Stuck Emotions, Medical Astrology, and Muscle Testing training and workshop. We're doing it live on August 29th of 2024. If you're watching this in the future, it's already available for you. So check it out. Link is in the description below. Thank you again so much, Elizabeth, for being here. And I'm super excited to reconnect on the 29th for our workshop.
Me too. Thanks for having me. I love being in front of your audience. They're good people, and there's always a really interesting discussion in the comments.
We do have good people here. So thank you guys for being awesome in the comments. Even if you leave nasty comments, that's okay. It'll boost us in the algorithm.
Yes. And I'm sure we will get the comment about where is Leo in our charts, because we both have long flowing hair.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's the highlight of either of our charts.
No, well, it's my midheaven. So it's what
It's
people
my
talk about in the
IC.
comments section of my videos more than anything else because it's right there.
It's my part of fortune. I
Oh,
I
nice.
feel like a Leo through and through, even though it's really not like
Your good fortune is your hair.
these are extensions. So I pay a fortune for me.
Well, perfect. On that note, we'll see you guys in the next one. And like the video, comment below, subscribe, and we'll see you on the 29th. All right. Bye, everyone.